Hello and welcome everyone with a new episode of Psyda Podcast. Today I have with me Doug Laney, who's an ex-vice president of Gartner, writer of Infonomics. We're going to be talking about a lot of things that are of very interest to our community in data science and artificial intelligence. But before we do, I just want to let you know that to continue these conversations even after the interview, you can join the Slack community that I have on Psyda. You could also listen to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcast. And feel free to drop any comments during the conversation. Doug, let's start with something that you talked in your book about a 12-year-old kid wearing space pajamas, staring at the TV screen. The night man landed on the moon. So tell us more about that kid.
That's a great question. So I was about five years old, and I'd just kind of gone to sleep, and I was all into kind of the whole space race. And yes, I had spaceman pajamas and probably the solar system hanging on a mobile from above my bed. And as I'm kind of going to sleep one night in July of 1969, my father wakes me up and he says, "Douglas, it's time." And we head down to the television, the black and white television, and he adjusts the antennas, right? And we watched the first steps on the moon landing, actually. And my father was a world-class engineer, and he was, he could have described how all of the actuators and the electromechanical components of the lunar lander probably worked if he had been given a schematic. But he was more impressed and moved by the fact that this was streaming into our living room and millions or billions of other living rooms around the world. And so I guess it made an impression on me that it was more about the information that we were seeing than the fact that we had actually landed. That was more incredible, or at least as incredible. And I think as we start to look at the ramifications of the moon landing and its impact on, say, the Cold War, the information at a macro level has takes on an entirely different kind of context. So perhaps that's what inspired me to kind of continue my journey into the realm of information and data and content. So, yeah.
I think that the sheer enormity of the whole experience and what it takes to drive a project of that nature probably led you to talk about assisting organizations with data monetization and valuation, open and syndicated data governance, and big database innovation.
Yeah.
And these are way too many big words for someone new to these terms. So I was just wondering, what is Infonomics for Dummies?
Right. So Infonomics is just the basic idea that data is an actual economic asset, is an actual asset, and should be treated like one. A lot of people talk about data as an asset, or talk about data as the new oil, right? But there's a lot more to it than that. Data has unique economic characteristics compared to oil, and unfortunately, data is not considered a balance sheet asset according to the accounting profession, which leads to all sorts of bad behaviors and suboptimal behaviors by organizations and business leaders. So the idea behind Infonomics is to, one, understand information's unique economic attributes and apply them in a business model context, but then also I think it's incumbent to measure and manage and monetize data as an actual asset.
We consultants, especially the research ones, are notorious for throwing in big terms, confusing people, and raking in a lot of bills. Yeah. But let's put that in context. You said in your Forbes article about Heinz, England, that it doesn't matter that current accounting regulations such as IFRS and US GAAP generally prohibit reporting the value of data on balance sheets. They care about putting data to work, and the data valuation for Heinz England, according to the article, was £200 million. And for some, that might be hard to establish, both the methodology and how you evaluated that. So if you could walk us through the process of and validity of such valuations. I'm thinking of affiliate agreements, sponsorships, outright data transfer, and analytics only information. And I remember one of the conversations that you had, we're going to be talking more about that, when you were selling your house, and the house was on the Zillow, and Zillow was missing out on the opportunity that they could make it some money off of your information if they could relate it to people like moving people, U-Haul, and other companies. So talk about it in the context of how do you evaluate this information?
Yeah, well, the story about selling our home was more about the bank itself, and that when you put your house on the market here, at least in the U.S. and in other countries, the listing for the home goes into a big database that's available pretty much for everybody to see nowadays. Zillow is an aggregator of that data from what's called the multiple listing service here in the U.S. As soon as your house goes on the market, everybody starts contacting you, the fly-by-night mortgage companies, the moving companies, the painters, the landscapers. You start getting everyone kind of reaching out to you to get a piece of the action when you're moving. Now, the only company that it seems didn't reach out to us was our own bank, and we bank with one of the largest banks in the U.S. by way of acquisition over the years. And what a terribly missed opportunity for the bank to reach out to us, to offer us a mortgage, offer us a home equity line, introduce us to our new branch wherever we're going to be moving, to help us move the stuff in our safety deposit box, to print us new checks with our new address on them. So an entirely missed opportunity. And I'm thinking, how difficult would it have been for them to hire some high school programmer, give him a can of Red Bull, and I'm not a sponsor, energy drink, and a bag of chips, and say, listen, match the customer, the individuals or the households in the MLS database to our customer database, so we know who's moving, right? And then we can reach out to them proactively. So it's not hard. Some of these ideas for using data and monetizing data and analytics are pretty stupid simple. Just companies, I guess, because they're not thinking about data as an asset, they don't manage it like one, and they don't generate economic benefits from it as they would with other assets.
I mean, I think that's kind of an idea which people would think that, we don't need Gartner consultants for that. I mean, we can figure that out. But, the other evaluations, like I mentioned in your Forbes article, about 200 million for Hybrid England, that's a big one. And people would, think twice about that. How did you come for that? So if you would just go out and hire these big four and ask them to actually audit that valuation, what would be their process to do that? You have talked about different pricing models. I'm
not saying the big four couldn't do that, but I'm just saying they typically don't. It's not part of their model to help companies understand the value of their data. I actually brought the idea of data valuation to one of the big four when I was working with them about 10 years ago or so, and they outright dismissed the idea. I said, one, from an M&A perspective, right? How does a private equity firm understand the value of the company that they're acquiring or taking public or merging if they don't fully assess all of its assets, including its data assets? And I don't know, I brought the idea to them, and they pretty much readily dismissed it. Now, the firm that I'm with right now, West Monroe, actually has an active business in helping organizations, particularly the private equity firms, understand do the technical diligence on M&A deals and carve-outs. And so part of what we're starting to offer now is that data valuation process where they can understand the value of the data assets that are being acquired or merged. And not just to understand their value, but understand their opportunity. So as you're bringing two companies together, there are opportunities to merge that data in new and innovative ways. So a private equity firm that has a portfolio of companies can think about how to combine that data in ways that can be monetized in new and innovative ways to create new kinds of value streams. So the process for valuing data is really, I mean, all I've done in Infonomics is really just adapt the way that valuation experts and accountants would value any kind of asset using the cost approach, the market approach, and the income approach. Now, the cost approach looks at what does it cost to acquire or to generate that asset, that data asset. The market approach looks at what could we sell that data asset for, or what could we trade it for. And one of the interesting, economic qualities of data is that it's a non-rivalrous, non-depleting asset, which means you can use it multiple ways simultaneously, and you can use it again and again without it depleting, which makes it, again, very different than something like oil. So when you're considering the market value of data, you have to look at the aggregate value that can be generated by a piece of data, a unit of data, a portfolio of data over and over within a market. So it's kind of an aggregate value, and there's an optimization kind of consideration there as well, in that if you price it very high, very few people will buy it. If you price it lower, more people will buy it, but eventually you start saturating a market and devalue the data asset. So there's a bit of an optimization concept built into that market value model. And then the third model is the income approach, which is what is that data asset's contribution to a revenue stream or expense savings. So where things get really interesting is where we find companies combine these models, where they identify data that has a relatively low cost basis, but that the value they're generating on top of it is fairly marginal. So they should be looking at ways to generate more and more value to grow the margin that they're generating on top of that data to better amortize it. So that's something that that I'm helping organizations with.
So what would your advice be, or even better, put you in the position of CDO at Netflix? How would you use these three pricing on a ballpark to monetize your data?
Well, again, to monetize the data or to value the data?
You have all three portions of that: monetize, value, and measure, right?
Right. So you want to talk about monetizing the data now?
Yes, I mean, if you were to put out the CDO position at Netflix.
Right. Okay. So really, with any company, when it comes to monetizing their data, it's about looking at all of the stakeholders that could potentially find value in that data or in analytics related to that data. Now, most companies are only looking very inwardly at their own business functions, their sales functions, their marketing functions, and so forth. But there's this world of external extended business ecosystem of suppliers and partners and customers partners and suppliers, customers, and so forth that might find value in the data that you compile. We often find that one person's trash is another person's treasure. There's some really great business models that scoop up data from an industry and then repackage it. So the process that we go through with companies is to, one, identify all of these potential stakeholders in the extended business ecosystem, understand their personas, their needs, what's driving their business, and then kind of map that to the data that is available, that we can make available, and see if there's anything that makes sense. When I run these workshops, we also recommend that they invite a key customer, supplier, partner into these workshops. Now, the other thing that we do is we look at hypotheses. So we look at kind of the business model and say, what are some things that we'd like to know about the business, or like to decide, or ways that we'd like to move the business that we can't because we don't really understand the data well enough, or we're not using the data well enough. Now, many companies are kind of stuck doing what's called hindsight-oriented analytics. They're looking at, they're building pretty pie charts or bouncy bar charts or dashing dashboards, right, to analyze data in hindsight. But they're not focusing enough on doing what we call diagnostic or predictive or prescriptive kinds of analytics. And those are the kinds of analytics that really move the needle much more on the business. So we look at ways to evolve the kinds of hindsight-oriented questions into more foresight-oriented questions. We also do this by looking at a number of use cases. So over the years, I've compiled nearly 500 use cases on how organizations are monetizing data in a variety of ways. and we bring forward some of those ideas, and we explore how we could tease them apart and adapt them to your own business model. We also look at the number of patterns, the various patterns that exist for monetizing data, from using it internally to improve business process performance, to improving relationships, to baking it into products and services, to extracting it from products and services and selling it outright, bartering or trading information in exchange for commercial terms, commercial goods and services or favorable commercial terms, selling data for cash, or putting it on data marketplaces. There's also a way that we've been working with clients, what I call an inverted data monetization model, where I can't sell you my customer data, but I can sell your stuff to my customers. I can't sell you my customer data because of regulatory restrictions like GDPR or others that vary by industry. But I can sell others' products and services to my customers and take a referral fee or a commission on that. So these are some of the exercises that we go through during the data monetization ideation process. Once we've generated a number of ideas, then we go into a feasibility assessment where we're looking at the feasibility of ideas on multiple dimensions. Are they ethically feasible, legally feasible, operationally feasible, managerially feasible, economically feasible, and so forth. And then we kind of see what floats to the top, and then we engage on building out those data products or data solutions in a much more kind of technical realm.
I think we can agree on the fact that there are people who would desperately need this information. Gartner does one of the largest surveys around the world of CEOs, CIOs in different industries, multicultural, multi-country samples, which I regularly go through. And then we have got Statista that sells a lot of data. And then we've got a lot of other companies with large data sets in market reports that would be very interesting to a lot of hedge fund capitals, other organizations going into different verticals. And one of the things because I want to dwell on this question a little bit to make it more understandable for a lot of people who the idea is very perplexing. You have a very funny way of putting things. So I was reading this Wall Street Journal quote that you were quoted in. It's flummoxing. The companies have better accounting for their office furniture than their information asset. And he also said that you can't manage what you don't measure.
Right.
And if we were to dwell on this point, I mean, it's all good that we conduct workshops and bring in the clients and brainstorm a way to measure that. But in the end, that's not something that you can put on your books. That's a very hard process to do. And I guess that's where the genius of Infonomics comes in, that it combines the information, economics, and a lot of other disciplines. But to quantify that on a balance sheet, that's something that a lot of people would find quite hard. So if you could just dwell on this a little bit and explain how that actually works. Sure.
Well, let's first review kind of the accounting regulations, which I'll tell you a little story. After 9/11, after the 9/11 terror attacks, some companies lost their data in the Twin Towers, and this was in the days before cloud and offsite backups. So companies actually lost their data. They didn't know who their customers were, their employees were. They lost contracts, transaction data, and it became a real existential event for them. So what they did, some of them would submit claims to their insurance companies for the value of the data they lost, and they just kind of estimated what was the impact on the business. The insurance companies rejected those claims, suggesting that data wasn't property and therefore was not covered by their property and casualty policies. This kind of caught my attention while I was at Gartner, and I helped some of the companies quantify the value of their data to kind of understand the loss. But again, the insurance companies rejected the claims. And what the insurance industry did in the U.S. was update the template used for commercial general liability policies to expressly prohibit or exclude electronic data from P&C policies. They did that a month after 9/11 to add further insult to injury. Now, the accounting profession followed suit and said, listen, if the insurance industry is not going to recognize data as property, we're no longer going to recognize it or allow anyone to recognize it as an asset. And they updated a key financial standard, IAS 38, which deals with how to recognize certain kinds of intangibles. and inserted some language prohibiting the capitalization of data, on balance sheets. So that's kind of where we are today, where most of the industry is trying to move forward and leverage and think about data as an actual asset, but the keepers of the definition of what constitutes property and what constitutes an asset have doubled down on their antiquated and arcane notions that it's not. And my hypothesis is that this is something that's been really holding back organizations. Now, today, if you wanted to include the value of your data on the balance sheet, you cannot do so, but there's no reason that you can't do it for internal purposes, to create a supplemental balance sheet. And this is what many companies have done in certain circumstances, like the airlines, United Airlines and American Airlines and Delta recently went through some effort to kind of quantify the value of their customer loyalty data so that they could collateralize it for loans. And what's interesting about this, as I wrote about in Forbes, is that the value of their customer loyalty programs was deemed to be 2 to 3 times more valuable than the companies themselves, which is fascinating. So I think that they're not alone. I think most companies will find that the value of their data, when they start looking at its potential, has more value than perhaps any other asset that the company has. And it's just that the insurance industry and the accounting profession have kind of been, holding us back. So, yeah. You're on mute.
Sorry. So what I meant is that, off the books, you can definitely do that, and everyone should do that in order to measure the information flow. But I guess, again, in the insurance context, when it comes to government regulation and everything else, it's just like claiming a $500 loss of iPhone for a $5,000 a claim. That's right. Something where it gets a little bit tricky. But let's, we're going to get back to that. But let's talk a little bit about Chicago Cubs.
Awesome.
You have been a lifelong fan, I believe. What if there was a scenario that they decided at some point that, in order to get their stats and scores and performance, you'd have to pay? Well, thanks to your own book, how does it actually look like from a consumer perspective?
Well, there are companies that it's not the Cubs really, not any individual baseball team that owns its stats. They're a major league franchise. So the major league MLB owns the rights to that data, and they make it available to various statisticians who produce more insights and analyses on that data. So the MLB actually does make a revenue stream by selling its data or licensing it to statistical companies.
So your hope is that MLB is going to do it for you,
for the baseball team.
So they pay Chicago Cubs, and you still have the access to that.
Right. But I think each team has its own statisticians that try to analyze data and come up with new algorithms and in their own ways, and they keep them very proprietary. This goes back to the days of the Moneyball story, right? Billy Beane and the Oakland A's. So, a lot of companies have statisticians now, or data scientists who are crunching, numbers for that team.
I think what I meant was that, if they shove the price model down to the customers and not the MLB, how would you feel about that? Now you can think also from a consumer's perspective and not an analyst perspective.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how that would work in what, actual value a consumer would have in statistical data other than for infotainment purposes. So that's a little bit difficult to quantify.
Yeah, I was thinking, if they would include this price into the season ticket or an app that you use.
Oh, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do.
Oh, they do?
Well, I'm sure they do. If you have to hire data scientists and statisticians, you have to pass that expense along somehow in terms of ticket sales or something else.
Doug, you also worked for Deloitte Analytics Institute, and you helped them grow multi-billion-dollar analytics business through marketing, social media, thought leadership, internal education, sales support, and a lot of that.
Right.
There's an estimated around 10 million data sets around that people can play with, use for their own purposes,
Open
create
data
models.
sets, yes.
Yeah. I was just wondering, you earlier talked about the fact that it's really hard for you to convince the Big Four of the information importance of data monetization. I mean, you were doing just fine at Deloitte. I mean, why wouldn't they listen to you?
I'm not sure that's something I really prepared to talk about publicly, but maybe it's something they just weren't ready for at the time.
Okay.
So,
well, in general, I guess we could open this question in a broader context. What are the restrictions for organizations, and what mindset do they have generally when they have resistance against ideas like monetizing the information and assets?
The general resistance against monetizing data is a bit of a naivete around exposing personal data. There certainly are ways to redact or encrypt or aggregate, or remove, personally identifiable information. Other companies, it becomes a bit of a reputational issue. I mean, so I met with and I can tell this story. They talk about it publicly. Allstate Insurance gets a call from I think it was General Motors. And they said, listen, we want to buy or license your automobile claims data so that we can analyze it to build better and safer cars. Well, that's a win-win-win for everybody, right? For the consumer, for the automobile maker, and for the insurance company. But Allstate said, listen, the problem is we're considered the good hands company. That's their motto. And we can't be seen as selling our customer data even for any purpose, even if we again redact it and anonymize it and so forth. So what I suggested to their head of analytics at Allstate was why don't this is not a data issue, it's not a technology issue, it's a reputational issue. So why not take this idea off brand, start a separate company or create a joint venture to do it? And within 7 months, they had launched Arity, Arity. It's a platform for not just Allstate, but I think for any insurance company to monetize its data. So sometimes the resistance is reputational. Sometimes it is overzealous lawyers, and very often it's a mindset that, listen, data is not our core product. We sell insurance, we sell cars, we sell refrigerators, and data is not our business. We don't really want to get into the data selling business, but I think it's a missed opportunity for many companies.
Let's talk a little bit about organizing that data also. I mean, just having data doesn't actually mean anything. You have to put that in context. You have to create hypotheses. You talked about that earlier in your conversations. And that brings us to who will do that, especially with the technical end. I mean, we can all strategize and gain information, put that in context, sit on top of that. But in order to create ETL pipelines from that, developing machine learning algorithms that would actually give us the accuracy on the model that we're using, classification, regression, trying to predict the future. That is something where the real value of information comes in. And in that context, in your personal experiences, hiring data scientists and importance of good data engineers to create reliable pipelines. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but yesterday LinkedIn was down for like
I noticed
10
for a while,
minutes, and Twitter was screaming like crazy. And when
mid-afternoon here in Chicago, it was down.
Yes, it was everywhere. So when a website like that goes down, it's not only a local issue anymore. It's around the globe. It's a chaos because a lot of people are doing this as a source of living.
Right.
And there are high stakes decisions.
Yeah, my wife runs a social media business where she helps emerging technology companies kind of get going on social media. And she had some clients who wanted some content posted, and she wasn't able to do so. So it became a business issue.
Yeah, exactly. And when we need qualified people to run that, data scientists, data engineers. And I don't know, what's your opinion on, is it as sexiest the job as it used to be, or at least it's hyped in the media? And then
the data scientist job or the data engineer?
The data scientist. And also, the follow-up question would be, you can take it together, that which one is valued more, because there's always a tussle between these two.
Yeah, I wouldn't say one is valued more than the other, but the data scientist job, certainly important. I don't know about sexy, but maybe I have a different opinion of what sexy is.
What word would you use?
Certainly a prominent and important role. Yeah. And on the back end, I think we tend to devalue the importance of integrating data, sourcing data in particular. If data scientist role is the sexiest role, I think one of the most important roles is the role of a data curator. You mentioned, the 10 million external data sets that are out there, public data sets. There are also thousands of data brokers. Any company has hundreds or dozens of partners who they can trade data, with or exchange data with. There are billions of social media posts, each day to be harvested. There are trillions of websites to be harvested. So there's a wealth of data out there beyond a company's own four walls that needs to be considered, if not actually harvested and integrated into the business. Especially today, when given the pandemic, most companies find that their forecasts are broken because their forecasts rely on their own historical sales data or whatever. And they're not taking into account what's happening in the larger world. What are the leading indicators of their business? So many companies are working with us to evolve from what we call trend-based analytics, using your own data, to driver-based analytics, understanding what are the external drivers of your business, customer sentiment, partner inventory levels, other ancillary products and services that tend to lead the sale of your own products and services. Those are the things that companies need to be considered with. But it's very difficult to just flip a switch and evolve from doing trend-based to driver-based analytics without having an active data curation function. So I think one of the most important jobs today that most companies don't have is somebody whose full-time role it is to identify external data sources that might be potentially valuable, determine how to get access to them, determine how to integrate them, how to pay for them or license them. I think it's a very important job that most companies don't have right now.
I was talking to Greg Coquillo a couple of weeks ago, who's a product manager at Amazon, and we had a fantastic conversation about the value of understanding the bigger picture in a business. So one of the reasons of a lot of frictions in these organizations is the lack of bridge between the technical and the strategic side. And in that context, I was discussing your book in our Slack channel with a couple of friends, and I don't know if that's something you have noticed or not, but the anachronistic nature of the basic concept of Infonomics is very interesting to me, because a lot of people think of it in context of tabular data. And I see it in a bigger picture with a lot of sentiment analysis and how it's shaping culture and in the society and international relations. Let's talk about the fact that a lot of that information generation is happening in journalism at the moment. We just come out of a very divisive election in the U.S. And the historical raid on Capitol Hill that is very unknown to people in democratic traditions. And I was just wondering, it could be a source if you use information as a valuable asset. And there's a lot of allegation on these big companies of tampering the election. And, in the previous election, we had the allegation of Russian interference. And I was just wondering, is it only me, or do you also see the bigger impact of how brilliant the idea of Infonomics is?
There's certainly a macro context to Infonomics, the value of data at a macro level, and it's something that I explore with my students in the MBA class that I teach at the University of Illinois. but it's not something that I've been exploring much from a commercial standpoint. But there's certainly some context there. I think it should be no surprise that we're starting to see a wealth of false data, whether it's deep fakes or just fake insights or fake data. As data becomes a product itself, it's following the same kind of trajectory that other kind of commercial products followed. You see the fake Gucci and Prada purses and shoes and so forth. I think it's no surprise that we're seeing a wealth of fake data as well. So I think it's going to be increasingly incumbent upon not just government organizations and the electorate to determine the validity of data, but also at a commercial level as well, increasingly so. And so, many companies are starting to form really full-featured data governance organizations and data governance functions, where they're starting to assess data's quality and validity and so forth before it ever finds its way into the decision-making or operational realm.
Picking up from your inspection of the data, I mean, that's where the problem comes in for most people, depending on, so it doesn't actually matter what side of the table they come from. So as you know, AI privacy and ethics have become a field in itself, and there have recently been firing of key people from Google in their AI ethics team. CNN report states that the 16-month congressional investigation into Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook has found that the tech giants hold monopoly power in key business segments, and have really abused their dominance in the marketplace. Full-throated condemnation of the giants. Does it bother you that Infonomics is the way to reach this monopolistic power in a way that that's kind of a lesson straight out of your book? And certainly you don't back that, but they've used it to an extent that would abuse a lot of corporate ethics. Well, let's talk about the fact that we're recently been a Bloomberg News about an actor. Sorry, I'm bad with names. His account was taken off, 500,000 followers from Facebook, and these were the same allegations that were leveled during the congressional hearing. So, what's your take on that?
First, let me say I don't refer to them as tech giants because technology is not what they sell. It's data, and information is what they sell. So I think it's a misnomer that is pretty common to refer to Google and Facebook as technology companies. They're not technology companies. They're data companies. Apple, is both a technology and a data company. But so let's kind of just first clarify that. Second, I think that there ought to be some concern about data monopolies, the formation of data monopolies or oligopolies, and that the government, probably should step in and ensure that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, I think the government is pretty, most politicians pretty naive about Infonomics kinds of concepts. So they would have to get a bit smarter before they try to enact any sort of legislation. As far as people getting kicked off of Twitter, that's all about terms of service. Terms of service are pretty clear. If somebody violates the terms of service, then Twitter, Facebook, whoever has every right to kick them off. So that's a simple answer there. It's not about people being canceled or being censored. It's about adhering to the terms of service for the free service that you're using. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let's not talk about you as Doug has worked with top brands and clients and big companies and helped them rake in millions of dollars. Talk about Doug when you plug out of the work, when you get back home. I'm just wondering, what are your odds? What game are you most likely to win if you played with me? Is it tennis or is it golf?
Yeah, well, I don't know how good you are at either, but
And that's the catch, actually.
I did play competitive tennis up until a few years ago. My shoulder is just not enjoying it as much as it once did. My doctor told me to stop serving 100 miles an hour, and I said, that's the best part of my game, so the rest of my game isn't as good. Golf is all right. I'm about a 14, maybe 15 handicap, so I just, it's just for fun. But this summer, I'm going to get into what's called pickleball. You heard of pickleball?
What's that?
So pickleball is kind of a cross between, table tennis and tennis, and it's played with a paddle and a kind of a wiffle ball, a plastic wiffle ball, played on like half of a tennis court. And the great thing about it is there's a little bit less movement, maybe some quicker movements than in tennis, but there's no serving overhand. You serve underhand. So I'm hoping to get into that this summer. I'm also can be found, weather permitting, biking along the Chicago lakefront. So I try to get in about 100 miles a week biking when I do that. And I'm also, speaking of data, I'm a bit of an Orange Theory junkie. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Orange Theory. It's I'd
like to know about that.
Yeah, it's a circuit training company that has facilities around the world. And you wear a wristband, and it tracks your heart rate, and they have you up on a board, and you can kind of compete a little bit with the other people in the session. So I'm looking forward to getting back into that once I get the vaccine, and I don't know. That's what kind of keeps me busy. Also, I enjoy cooking, and I've been baking a lot this winter. I bake more than I can eat or than I should eat, so I'm always giving it out to our neighbors or family.
What's the best that you can cook?
The best that I can cook? I'm probably pretty good with some Asian foods and Latin American. Probably Latin American's my best types of meals. I was in Peru last year. I spoke at the first annual Latin American Chief Data Officer Summit, and spent some time in Peru and really got to appreciate the food there, and immediately came home and had to cook a complete 8-course Peruvian meal for my family.
Okay, well, that requires a marathon afterwards to digest that, no?
Yeah.
Have you ever tried marathon, by the way? And a lot of people, in corporate echelons, that's kind of be a favorite sport.
I'm flat-footed, so running is not really my thing.
Don't you have shoes now that actually support your?
They do, and I run when I'm at Orange Theory. I'll run 3 or 4 miles or whatever, but it's not one of my favorite things to do. I much prefer to be on the bike.
Okay. Getting back to Gartner for a little bit, I'm an absolute fan of the work that they do there. It's been for years, and I read every report that they come out with. And recently, there's been a new one, a fantastic trends report by Daryl Plummer, the chief of research in Gartner at the moment. And he talks about a lot of technologies that are not market ready at the moment, but hold a lot of promise. We're talking about DNA storage, quantum computing, carbon nanotubes, in his strategic technology prediction report. And one of the interesting part of that is he talked about how the Moore's law is now hitting the wall. So that isn't really true anymore, or at least it has lost its rigor. Which brings us to the question that if we don't have enough compute and storage power for the enormous data gathering potential technologies, it seems like a standoff to me. I mean, what are we going to do with all this data and not enough power to actually compute it? I mean, as it is, we're working in research companies in machine learning algorithms. We're finding new ways to find better, powerful GPUs and smarter ML algorithms. With existing data, we are kind of out of options. What are we going to do with the new ones?
I think, perhaps, I haven't really looked into it, but Moore's law, might be hitting the wall when it comes to kind of silicon and, typical electron-based systems. But I think we will certainly see a quantum shift as we move into quantum computing, and then we'll kind of start all over again. So, I'm not too concerned about hitting a wall. So I think companies need to be a little bit more efficient, thinking about being efficient at processing and storing data. And some of the work that I've been doing in Infonomics has helped companies rationalize their data environments. They're keeping and storing data online that has a low economic value compared to its cost. There's some companies who we've worked with who have determined that the value of the data that they're storing is less than the economic value that the value that they're generating is less than its cost. And so they've been able to make a defensible deletion or a defensible archival kind of decision to reduce their infrastructure costs by millions of dollars a year. I think I just heard that Amazon's server farms now consume more electricity than, I forget which Latin American country it was, maybe it was Chile. So that's certainly a concern, right? And one of the things I'm really not quite keen on is the amount of energy that we're spending mining for Bitcoin. I think that's ridiculous. There's got to be a better way. And
that's a good question. How much
not good for the ecology?
That's an interesting one, because we had a lot of conversation with Doug about how much of his asset he's going to put in Bitcoin. I don't know where you stand on that, but now we have Elon Musk's support of Dogecoin and other cryptocurrencies. Some people think it's totally baloney. What about you?
I have no opinion on it really either way.
And you don't own any either?
I don't know that it's baloney. I just, the U.S. went off the gold standard, 40 years ago or so. And so it's all based on the faith and credit that you place in, whoever's managing that currency. So
and for now, it's no one.
I'll leave it there. Yeah. Or not no one, but we don't know who it is. Right.
Unless you're Satoshi.
Right. Perhaps. I don't really have much of an opinion on that. But going back to Gartner, Gartner publishes that technology trends report each year. So you can go back a few years and see some really interesting things about blockchain and digital twins. I think is going to be really, really interesting. Creating digital twins of the business. I think that the creating a digital twin of the business is going to lead to what I call the self-driving enterprise, where an organization can actually run on its own with minimal or not nominal human intervention. We already see this to some degree with trading firms, but I think the day is coming where any kind of company can pretty much operate autonomously.
I think that's a very interesting point that you raised there with digital twins, because a lot of corporate governance and security issues would arise if you were to use the algorithmic architecture of Bitcoin and transferred that to the regular ones, like normal businesses. It would help, certainly. A lot of countries who are not on the grid, for example, in Pakistan, we don't have PayPal, and I have no idea why they're not. It seems to be like a couple of countries that they still aren't willing to come to. But I was just wondering, for other companies, the big companies, what would their apprehensions be in order to use algorithms like Bitcoin? Because that would be certainly very hard to monitor that.
Yeah, one is kind of the auditability of Bitcoin is suspect if you're trying to follow a transaction. The second is the performance. So if you're trying to handle high volume transactions using blockchain, the technology is not there yet.
That's a very good one, actually. Yeah, I was thinking the same. Let's talk a little bit about organizations handling and storage of data. On-prem versus cloud. Okay. Where do you go?
I think it's inevitable that most everything is moving to the cloud. There's no reasonable reason why any organization today should have the bulk of its data on-prem and have a capital expenditure that's depreciating the day they install it, right? It's outdated the day they install it. So, getting back to the point that most companies should focus on their core business, IT shouldn't be the core business of most companies. And so I certainly see every rational reason for it to be outsourced. You have the ability to handle dynamic workloads, to not have to deal with upgrades. So I think the reasons are certainly more and more compelling every day.
But don't you see a confounding variable here, which is the nature of data itself? For example, you don't want government to put all your data on AWS. Do you?
I might trust AWS to manage the government's data better than I would trust the government to manage it.
Okay.
So that's another point. How good are you as a company at security and privacy and governance and all of that compared to a company that does that for a living? Probably most companies are not up to the level of security and privacy controls that that AWS or Google or others have.
You probably have worked with them at some point. I'm just curious, why would you trust AWS more than government?
I'm not really saying it's either or. There are probably some government functions that are more buttoned up. Maybe the CIA, FBI, NSA, are a little bit more have even greater controls than cloud providers. I don't know. I don't concern myself much with the physical aspects of data storage.
Okay. One of the things that you've talked very passionately about, and I think that was part of one of your talks at CIO, which is what happens to data democratization, like open source models, donation-based models, freemium pricing. If everyone came from if I may, a scarcity mindset that Infonomics kind of seems to advocate. In your defense, maybe you do see commercial Infonomics separate from the non-commercial endeavors. For example, if we didn't have this openness of data, intellectual exchange, ability to connect with each other across the world, I mean, this conversation wouldn't be happening. So if we took Infonomics at its face value, do you think it's a problem, or it's a part of, or it's a solution to the problem?
Part of Infonomics deals with understanding the application of traditional economic principles like supply and demand and pricing and elasticity and productivity frontiers and marginal utility and so forth, even monopolies and data oligopolies. And so the problem is that those economic concepts were designed with traditional goods and services in mind, physical goods and services and labor in mind, and were never designed with any consideration for data as a distinct kind of asset or resource. In Econ 101, we always talk about guns and butter, right? So what we've done, some colleagues at Gartner and I have done, was look at these core economic principles and how they need to be perhaps tweaked or adapted for data assets. And there's some really interesting things that for producers and consumers of data to consider in terms of data pricing and elasticity and supply and demand. And so there's some really prescriptive advice in my book about considering these models in the context of whether you're a producer or a consumer of data and how that could affect the architecture.
Do you suggest different models for consumers and producers?
So certain models have more impact for producers or consumers, but so
in what way would that be different?
Marginal utility has more of an impact on probably a consumer. The things like pricing and elasticity have more of a kind of effect on probably the producer.
Okay. I don't know if you've heard about
but they're two sides of the same coin,
I guess. Eric Weinstein recently challenged the whole economic theory with his gauge theory. It's a little complicated, but what he says that, and I kind of agree with that when you study these courses in macroeconomics and MBA, about the indices with which we measure society, like GDP, inflation, and other things. They're very tricky, and they haven't been serving us well. So I was just wondering if you have a take on that.
Yeah, I may have put this quote in the book. I can't remember whether it ended up in there. It was a quote by President Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, who said something along the lines of the things that we measure for the economy are not necessarily the right things. That there are things that we should be measuring that we're not. And it also reminds me of the country of Bhutan, which has which has a gross happiness index. I think every country should have a gross happiness index.
That's a very good thing, actually. I mean, and you probably know there is a Gini index, which kind of ranks people on the happiness curves also. So Scandinavian countries are kind of highest on that. I've had guests previously in my show talk a lot about psychology of how it's constructed, and one of my own research in psychometrics is very helpful in evaluating those claims. For example, there's a lot of suicide and mental disorders in the countries which are highest on the happiness index, and I was just wondering, how do they even construct that? A parallel between the GDP, how it's constructed, and Infonomics is very interesting to me. For example, GDP does not actually capture all the information and indices, which are in some way not even quantifiable, to make an index called GDP. And I think Infonomics kind of is falls into the same paradox or dilemma. Do you have a suggestion for GDP also, as well as for Infonomics?
Yeah, let me give you an example of where the GDP fails to capture the value of data. You go into the grocery store, right? And where's my card here? You go into the grocery store and you scan your loyalty card, right? And so what happens is you get a discount on your groceries. But what's really happening, we know what's really happening. Most people know what's really happening, which is it's actually a barter transaction. You're exchanging information about you and your purchase for free food.
Mm-hmm.
So who's cut out of that transaction? The tax man, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not taxable. The discount is not taxable. So the reason they call it a discount is, obviously to avoid taxation. But even when you're bartering with information, if I'm a company and I'm where I'm exchanging information about my sales or my inventory or my forecasts with my suppliers, so that they know how much to supply me, and in return, I get a discount on their goods and services, or I get favorable, delivery terms. That has some commercial value, but it's not any kind of commercial value that's captured by the GDP.
Such a clever answer. Actually, when I was reading your book, I did find this. This is such an astute point, which I don't know if people have noticed that or not. Because when you sell your information and you have hard cash, that's tax deductible. And that's taking out from the value that you're providing to other people. But if it's a barter exchange of something else that can indirectly or directly generate cash value or brand value, that would be such a fantastic idea.
Right.
And I was just wondering,
black market, but it's kind of there's this legitimate gray market for data among trading partners.
I mean, if you put it that way, all Big Four are involved in black market, because they're telling you ways to cut taxes, which is a legal way. So it's not that it's illegal. So I was just wondering, who inspires you? I mean, to a lot of people, you inspire and
thank you.
Give them information that is really valuable for their business and personal growth. Who inspires you?
Wow, there's a lot of people in the industry who are inspiring me in different ways. Kind of tough to mention the gentleman Bill Schmarzo, and I've been
good friend of mine,
collaborating for years on this concept of data economics. John Ladley, many other people, and kind of going back in time, there have been some economists that have been inspired by. So yeah.
Who's your favorite economist?
I'm trying to remember his name. He worked with Marvin Minsky at University of Chicago. I'm just blanking on his name right now. Gary Becker, Dr. Gary Becker.
Okay.
And back in the 1960s, he realized that labor, workforce, or whatever we used to call it back then, was a legitimate economic asset and could be treated and managed like an actual economic asset. And he's the one who came up with the idea for human capital. Actually wrote a book called Human Capital. And now we use that term human capital now, even though we can't put the value of our company's humans on the balance sheet. Why we can't do that? Because we don't own and control them. That's one of the qualities of an asset. An asset has to be something that you own and control. And in countries that have outlawed slavery, you cannot own and control people anymore. So you can't claim them as a balance sheet asset. But Gary Becker said, listen, that notwithstanding, we can and could be managing our workforces with the same kind of discipline as we manage our other kinds of more traditional physical and financial assets. And so I was really inspired by his work on that, in coming up kind of with the Infonomics idea on treating information as an actual asset.
When do you think the first roots of Infonomics took place in you, and how long did it actually take to fully grow into a tree?
Well, I think it really kind of hit home after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when I realized that companies couldn't claim the value of their data on their insurance policies, and then what the insurance industry did to deny those claims and then change the policy. So that really hit it for me. I think even before that, in building data warehouses back in the mid 90s or so, it occurred to me that data had this potential economic value, and I was just kind of more involved in helping to build those data warehouses and the process around that than really the economic value. But one of the things that we did for clients in building their data warehouses was we would analyze and profile the source data to identify the best sources and how they could best be integrated. And so that kind of assessment of the underlying source data is probably where the early inklings of understanding data's real economic or financial value stems from.
Well, as someone who has actually studied very deeply both economics and information theory, I still think there are missing puzzles. So what other subjects you actually took the lessons from? Because that's a lot more than these two.
Yeah, there are other lessons in not just understanding data's value, but in managing data's value that can be learned from other kinds of asset management principles and practices. There are standards, even ISO standards, for how to manage physical assets, supply chain, IT assets, human capital, library science, records management, financial asset management. There are all these asset management principles and practices that we as data professionals have really done a pretty poor job of paying homage to and leveraging. And so part of the book, I suggest ways to leverage concepts from different asset management concepts in how organizations should manage their data assets.
I think one of the favorite concepts from asset management, and it kind of, when I read the book, it immediately drew my attention to the book and the philosophy of investment by Buffett. And a lot of it is actually very similar to how we manage information, because in order to succeed in investment and gaining consistent returns, you have to be up to date on the information and what's the bigger picture and how it's developing. And I was just wondering, in your professional life, if you worked with any of those investment funds, venture capitalists, or anything that has to do with financial sector, and gave them a holistic picture of what's happening and what's going to happen.
No, not much of a holistic picture. We're just kind of more looking at company by company. Holistically, we'll look at the portfolio of companies within a private equity firm's portfolio, but not at any particular macro level. No.
Can you think of any application for the industry?
Well, there is, and I don't want to say too much right now, but there's an investment firm that we started working with that is positioned to help organizations capitalize upon their latent data assets, much the same way that a real estate prospector or an oil prospector would work, identifying an oil field or identifying an empty lot that's owned by somebody and saying, listen, we'd like to lease that from you, extract value from it, and I'll kind of take a cut of that action. So it's a business that we're starting to get involved with an investment firm.
You don't seem to be a big fan of economists' idea of data is the new oil.
No, as I mentioned earlier, data has these unique economic properties that are very different than oil. Yes, you extract oil, you plumb oil, you refine oil fuels processes. Yeah, so there's some similarities there, but that's kind of where they end. The real interesting comparisons between data and oil are where they differ. And that is that when you consume a drop of oil, you can only consume it one way at a time. When you consume a drop of oil, it dissipates. It turns into energy and pollutants, right? And when you consume a drop of oil, it doesn't create more oil, right? It's not regenerative in that way. Data is very different. When you consume data, it doesn't go away. You consume it multiple ways simultaneously for multiple processes. And that when you consume data, you're typically, whenever you're using data, you're typically in a position to capture more data about the results of using that data. And so in that way, it's somewhat regenerative. So I think companies that understand those differences and have capitalized on them are the ones that are really thriving today in the data economy. And in fact, some research that I did bears that out. We find that companies that demonstrate certain kinds of behaviors, like if they have a chief data officer or a data science organization or a data governance organization, that these kinds of companies have a market to book value ratio that's nearly 2 times higher than the market average. So there's something that investors favor about companies that exhibit data-centric, data-savvy kinds of behaviors. And the companies that are information product companies that make most of their revenue by selling or licensing data, those kinds of companies have a market to book value ratio that's nearly 3 times higher than the market average. So I don't think there's any more compelling reason to become a data-savvy, data-centric, or data product kind of company than that.
And I find this fascinating, the same conversation when you had it at MIT Chief Data Officer Information Quality Symposium last year with Dave Vellante, and you talked about American Airlines, United Airlines, how their actual valuation, third-party valuations are way higher than their market cap. But I guess this engenders 2 questions. One would, again, going back to how do you actually generate this valuation? And surprisingly, that don't you think it's on some level it's a wrong incentive for manipulative organizations? I mean, forget about the market cap, just focus on data, just mash it up, conjure something, keep everyone entertained. I mean, we already know what happened at Enron. And then if you just blow it out of proportion and look at the global picture, we already have corporations like Monsanto tried to trademark the basmati rice, which is the Indian product, and a lot of other things. I mean, we're not saying that it always happens, but there is a possibility for it to happen. And if you're incentivizing them on data and not on their actual asset-based valuation, you're giving them the wrong bone.
Well, I don't know. I think data is an asset. It should be something that should be valued alongside of financial and physical assets and other kinds of intangibles like copyrights and patents and trademarks are valued. So why wouldn't data be valued on a balance sheet? It's something certainly that you own and control. It's exchangeable for cash, and it generates what accountants call probable future economic benefits. That's the definition of what constitutes an asset. And there's no legitimate reason, I don't think, why data shouldn't be considered an asset. And even board members from the Financial Asset Standards Board, FASB, agree with me.
I see your point totally, but that's my job to play devil's advocate, so I'm going to do that. Which is that there's a lot of discussion about in open source communities. So we have got MIT license, Creative Commons has a huge claim to that. I was part of one of the founders of Wikipedia here in Pakistan, believed a lot in Creative Commons, creating open educational resources. I've been sitting on the board of WikiEducator, which is the largest wiki for educators after Wikipedia. So I have some very strong opinions on that. And I really value your opinion on that. So this gives me actually an opportunity to exchange ideas and where we come from. And when we talk about open source community, some people would call it hypocrisy. We talk about OpenAI's GPT-3. It's such a wonderful product. I don't know. And, it was built by the collective efforts of developers and engineers and a lot of other people throughout the globe. It took blood, sweat, and tears. And now when the time comes for people to actually use that information in their own products, they just shut it down in the name of security. Well, that's not very secure for people who are using it for manipulative purposes. And I was just wondering if that's the a lesson that inadvertently you're giving out to people who contribute. What does future hold?
Well, one of the economic ways to look at data's value is not just intrinsically to an organization, but what kind of good it's providing. So I see more and more companies embarking on data for good kinds of initiatives, where they're making their data available to help society in one way or another. And obviously, I'm a big fan of that, and that value is difficult to measure, right? Not that it can't be measured, but it's difficult to measure, and it's something I'm certainly an advocate of. And I think any company that's sitting on data that has potential societal benefits, and they're not making that available, is not being a responsible corporate citizen. So yeah.
Oh, that's good coming from you. That you at least do support the idea that things that are for public good should be available to public. I wanted to also get your opinion, being a thought leader on topics on big data, privacy, and ethics. What do you think about this recent catfight between Apple and Facebook?
The one I've been kind of paying attention to is the one with Facebook in Australia.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's been really interesting. So I don't. What's the one with Apple and Facebook?
That was over this privacy issue also, because recently, was it like a couple of weeks ago, WhatsApp rolled out a privacy policy in which everyone had to actually accept that. That they would sell the data. And, there was a huge backlash against that. People just converted to Telegram or Signal. Their subscription rose in millions overnight, and then they had to actually eventually roll it back. Yeah. And Apple got furious because they generally are, well, let's say not as bad on data selling as everyone else. And I'm just wondering, do you have a favorite there?
Listen, I think that any kind of application that we as a consumer are getting for free, we should understand that people said, okay, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. I'm not actually the product. I'm the producer of the product, which is the information. And so if you're getting any kind of application for free, you ought to expect that app provider is monetizing your content in some way, and that's a fair trade. Again, that's a barter transaction, right? Again, something not captured by the GDP. And so I think that's perfectly fair and understandable. It's just that companies need to be transparent about it. And that's what WhatsApp was doing. The terms and conditions for for usage of these applications perhaps could be a bit more transparent. I would certainly agree with that.
I totally get where you're coming from. I mean, I guess there is a tacit contract that if you're using a service for free, it comes with strings. So it's not like free as in free beer. So you can probably either use it or leave it. But again, let's talk about. I mean, you already talked about the issue with Australia, and now that's a whole new level. You're picking a fight with a whole country, and I'm just wondering, how do you analyze the situation there?
I haven't read deeply on it yet, but I understand that the media companies are concerned that they are losing eyeballs because Facebook is aggregating the news, right? And so Facebook, I guess, in recent days has said, okay, we're going to shut down the news feeds, right, from the news outlets and see what happens. And we all know what happens, which is it decreases people clicking through to the news feeds and subscribing. And that's no surprise to me at all. And I think it was pretty naive of the media outlets and the governments to complain about Facebook not aggregating, but summarizing the news and providing links to news, which I don't have any problem with. I think it could only help the news industry.
Despite the face value of who was right or wrong, don't you think that that can trigger a lot unpleasant response, a bigger unpleasant response across countries in terms of international relations, and it's not as small as it seems? Or do you think it's just a normal business practice?
I don't know that's going to affect international relations too much. I mean, maybe it has with some of the stuff between China and the U.S., but that was probably just something that the previous administration was trying to make hay out of, illegitimately so. So I think it's interesting. There are some people who see these multinational technology and information companies as being global entities themselves, like countries in and of themselves. And there's an interesting philosophy, around that Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp and Alibaba and others are effectively kind of countries of their own.
I don't know if your story goes back because I find it really hard to believe that apart from your Gartner aura, you don't have opinions on general things of public good, international relations, and things like this. Do you really think like you very generally put that these companies are not tech companies, these are big data companies,
right?
And at some point people fight over data also, especially when it becomes so connected with everyone's life. We have this huge issue between China and US for the past 4 years continuously in one form or another about COVID-19 allegations, and then the trade bans and tariffs. Absolutely unnecessary, at least in my opinion. I was just wondering, as someone who has traveled all over the globe, understand this to the granular level, you must have opinions on that. And how did it actually play out? Was it beneficial for the businesses or not? Was it necessary or not? Apart from your political beliefs, you do have some opinions, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think it was necessary. I think it was political posturing for the most part. And I think any kind of lack of transparency by any of these data or technology companies is easily exposed and affects their reputation and sales without any kind of real government intervention that's necessary. So
I think fairly too much government intervention can be a problem for both businesses and economics. Well, let's take a segue to another thing that you have done very ardently, which is teaching. Both at what university that you teach on, and your immensely famous courses on Coursera about Infonomics. And I was just wondering, you come from a very research-oriented background with Gartner and Deloitte, getting out there, KPIs, achieving things, getting things to work. How does it actually feel to talk to students, get into the theory of it and less of the ROI perspective?
Yeah, somebody recently on LinkedIn accused me of promoting my Coursera class as being something to generate passive income. And they should know that I actually don't get paid for that Coursera course. Okay. It's
if you do?
It's an adaptation of the course, the MBA course that I teach. And it's just something that the University of Illinois has put on Coursera and that I've done just out of to kind of give back to my alma mater. So
I'm just curious, why would that be a bad thing, even if you did?
I don't know. It wouldn't be a bad thing. Just somebody was trying to poke fun at me, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, the reason that I love teaching the class is not for any kind of supplemental income, but I love the bright minds that are taking this class, that are exploring new ideas about data's economic features and the way it affects the economy. And we're always exploring new ideas. There's been some really great papers that my students have written that I'd love to get published somehow if I could find the time and to do that. But my goal, here's my goal, is to have one of my students go on and some of them have actually applied to PhD programs to study data, information economics or infonomics, and my wish is that one of them one day wins a Nobel Prize.
Okay, you don't wish it for yourself though.
No, probably not. I'm
Probably not.
not that smart.
Apart from that, I was just wondering, what did you learn from the experience, like teaching? Because they're a very different field. I'm a university professor also, and teaching classes, and that's a total different ball game in comparison with the industry when you get to the bare knuckles.
It is. I think when I do a lot of speaking, and the speaking is usually up on a stage and you're expressing ideas and kind of being an infotainer sometimes, right? But I think working with the students, it's more engaging and more interactive, and I really enjoy that. So sometimes I'm told I challenge their ideas a little bit too much. Like, all right, great idea, but you really haven't thought it through very well. So I need to kind of pull back on that a little bit the next time I teach the class.
Yes, there are some very interesting opinions on how organizations are structured. One of the arguments that I saw you advocating very passionately is about the distinctions between CIOs and CTOs and CDOs and the job roles. Do you want to open this Pandora box again?
Here's my prediction, and I tried to get this prediction into some research at Gartner, but there was some resistance for obvious reasons, because Gartner's typical buyer is the chief information officer. So my prediction is that that IT as a discipline, as an organization, is going to bifurcate into separate I and T organizations. Now, where does that leave the CIO? Maybe kind of left out. What we need is somebody who's managing the data and someone who's managing the technology. And in my mind, that's the chief data officer and the chief technology officer. So unless a CIO can kind of adapt to becoming one of those players, then there's really, I think the future doesn't hold a lot of role for a chief information officer. Now, it's a bit of a wild prediction, and I'm perfectly happy to be wrong, but I've already seen several companies and even government organizations who have separated their IT functions into separate I and T functions. And one pharmaceutical company, in fact, and I think there's another couple companies that I've come across who have said, yeah, we don't need a CIO anymore. We just need a chief data officer and a chief technology officer. And so they've kind of dismissed that position.
And I'm sure, I hope that I'm not misquoting Dave Vellante. And during a conversation, he talked about the fact that keeping a CIO is just like, having a fox watching out for the hens. And I was just wondering if you like the analogy there.
I don't know about that, but most CIOs tend to behave as if their middle name is infrastructure. The I stands for infrastructure rather than information, and that's fine. But I think that information has become secondary to technology. And that's not where it belongs at all. Technology comes and goes. Information assets are reusable, and really what fuels the business, not the technology per se.
Another thing that I really admire about you is your reading. You're a very well-read man, and I must say, at the expense of those others, supposedly market researcher, thought leaders, and pretty much empty when you read their work. You talk about one of your articles, was it on Governance Info, about Cushing, who's the first known man from the book *Sapiens*.
Oh, right.
Joe Welner.
Right.
I do a lot of my research, so I do read stuff. So, and you have a very interesting premise, which is kind of baffling, but nonetheless, you have the right to have that, which is that kings, prophets, and deities. These are things that come and go. Even deities, which is surprising.
Right.
And you seem to value the work of accountant above all, because what in Cushing, this believed first person on earth was for accounting, which
we know, right?
Yeah, and I was just wondering, don't you think accountants come and go as well?
I'm sure they do. Accounting practices haven't changed much, at the course for about 500 years, since Luca Pacioli, architected or formalized the double entry accounting system, and we're kind of there's not been a lot of innovation. I do a talk on accounting innovation, and it's kind of funny. But anyway, I'm not going to to disparage anyone. I just thought it was interesting that the first person whose name that we know in history was an accountant. So that was an interesting fact.
Yeah, but do you really think that in the longer run, in the grand scheme of things, they outperform kings and deities and prophets?
Well, I mean, they're known as what I think they were known as the eyes and the ears of the king, right? I think I wrote in the book, so today they're the eyes and ears of the business, and their eyes have not been open to the value of data, and or been closed to the value of data. And I think that's a mistake. I think the accounting profession could do the world and companies and investors and its own profession a really good favor if they open their eyes to the value of data.
There's such a beautiful parallel between what the basic premise of the book is. Sapiens, which is that human beings are the only species that create stories, believe in them, and actually sell them. And I think the parallel between the Sapiens and Infonomics is an interesting one. Do you also see this parallel, or?
I have Sapiens on my reading list, but I haven't read it yet. So
you took the bits and pieces then for the article, I guess?
For the article, I actually found that piece somewhere else. I found that story about Kushim somewhere else, not in Sapiens.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I must have misread that.
Yep.
You're also a top 10 data science influencer. On Kitty Nuggets, you're in top 20 big data influencers. Only like a top 5 big influencer. A lot of tops there. And I'm just wondering, we've talked a fair bit about that. You as a consumer on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and WhatsApp and what have you, how do you see your own pattern of information consumption and activity on these platforms change, especially after the NSA breach and Snowden's whistleblowing? Because that's kind of a landmark on how people view things and use of VPN.
I don't think that affected me at all. I mean, I love learning from what other people write on LinkedIn and Twitter and elsewhere, but and I also love engaging in debates. There's some really fun debates that we've had on LinkedIn around, data versus information, right? And how to value data. There've been some really, or what I'm doing. I'm kind of involved in a debate right now around, what is innovation, right? Does innovation actually have to be something that's consumable? And I argue that it isn't, that there are plenty of innovations that have never seen the light of day, never seen commercial success. To deny them innovation status, even though perhaps they've even received patents, I think is disingenuous. Yes, the goal of any innovation perhaps ought to be something that provides some kind of commercial value or societal good, but that's not the definition of innovation. So I've been having, we have some fun kind of debating on LinkedIn, and I think that's as mind expanding for me as actually reading a book. Many books I tend to just kind of skim through and just go, wow, this is 200 pages, and there were maybe 4 interesting points, made in the book. And sometimes I wonder whether a lot of books were just written by ghostwriters. I don't know. So,
what do you think of Originals by Adam Grant? One of my favorite authors. He's kind of the guy who, when he writes books, you can be pretty sure that most of those pages would have information.
Yeah. I don't know. Can't speak to his books. So,
what is your favorite?
My favorite book? Favorite book I read this year was the Born to Run.
Okay.
By Christopher McDougall. It's a story about ultra marathoners and what they go through, and then the discovery of this tribe in Mexico, hidden tribe that they run as part of their culture. And it was just a fascinating book. The intersection of running and anthropology and physiology and even a little bit of business. When they talk about like the Nike running shoes, fascinating book. But this year.
Would you say you have outgrown your space pajamas, or you're still into fiction?
Not enough into fiction. I need to read more. I try to bounce between a fictional book and a business book. The business books I tend to get through really quickly. But yeah, I think certainly given the pandemic, it's been an escape to read a bunch of fiction. And I used to listen to a lot of podcasts, but almost all podcasts the last 6 months have been about the pandemic. So they haven't been really a good escape from a good mental escape from it. So I've kind of reverted back to books, and actually audiobooks. So while I'm biking or working out or resting, or before I go to sleep, I'll listen to some audiobooks.
What's the latest that you've been listening?
What did I just finish up? I just started. I don't remember what it's called. I just started another book about by an Irish writer. My wife recommended, but I don't recall what it's called.
If that in your lifetime becomes actually a possibility, and that might give you a rerun of your childhood. If SpaceX actually sends a mission to Mars, would you buy a ticket?
Probably not for me.
Who do you hate so much that you're going to buy it for?
I do have some ideas there. Again, I'm not going to disclose them publicly. But I tell you what, when I saw the recent the Mars landing last week, again, I got choked up. It just brought me back to the time when I sat in front of the television with my father watching the first moon landing.
You must have brought nostalgia.
Yeah, he passed away a few years ago, so I don't know. Just
I'm sorry.
Brought back a bit of nostalgia.
Do you remember your childhood? What was it like being with your father? What did you learn from him a lot?
I remember him teaching me how to program. He came home with one of the first computers in the neighborhood, old vector graphic MZ CPM machine, before the Apple II and all that. And you taught me how to program. But then he admonished me and he said, "Listen, that's a vocational field." He said, "You're kind of a deeper thinker and a good writer, and learn how to write and speak. Programming is great; it'll take you so far, but learn how to write and speak." And it's something that he never really learned to do well, and he always regretted it, and so didn't want that for me. So he ingrained from me from an early age to value the ability to communicate, not just in written code, but in English.
Such a wise lesson, because from what I know now, when I hire a lot of people, engineers and other people, the only thing that they actually lack is to be able to communicate their ideas. And this is probably what you mentioned earlier, that a lot of innovations simply get lost.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's a real epidemic right now of a lack of data literacy. That's something we haven't touched on yet, but the ability for data people to communicate with business people and vice versa. And so that concept of data literacy or data fluency is a really hot topic now among organizations. We're building data literacy programs and training classes and stuff for companies to help them build their data-driven culture through a greater level of understanding of what is data, what does it mean, what are its limitations, what are different ways to express data and analytics, what's the difference between a data warehouse and a data lake, and why are data architecture so complicated, and so forth. And so I've really enjoyed actually training business people on the kind of the joys of data and analytics.
I'm glad you brought it up, because that's a very good opportunity to answer a question that I get a lot. At some point I'm thinking I should record a clip and just send it out so that I don't have to answer that a lot. And there have been books, very good books written on that. Miko Yuki, I think, has written one about storytelling. And I'm just wondering, this concept is really missing in the whole training and development and research and articles. You read articles on Forbes, CIO, Harvard Business Review, a lot about different things, technical things, nothing about the bigger picture, the storytelling. Tell us a little bit about data literacy and how it connects with storytelling, and that's what actually generates value for business leaders.
Data scientists have to realize that people consume information in different ways, or prefer to consume information in different ways. And sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's more audible, sometimes it's in terms of a story. And I think most people respond to stories. If you think about the information that has lasted the longest in human history, they're stories. They're not data points, right? They're stories of that have been passed down from generation to generation. So there's something about a story that resonates and sticks in the brain. And so data scientists, rather than, again, just providing pretty pie charts, ought to be encapsulating that information in a story that resonates with somebody, that appeals to them, their ethos, pathos, and logos. And it's something that I think data scientists really need to get better trained on.
That's certainly a self-fulfilling prophecy when you look at the biblical literature that we have and other religions as well. These are stories that are handed down from people to other people, and only now we actually have the computational power to use transformers and other techniques to be able to make sense of that word clouds. Just tell a little bit about, you briefly mentioned storytelling, but you are the one who have sit through the board meetings and C-suite employees a lot. Tell them what actually are they looking for? Because, as data scientists, we can complicate things a lot. And when I mean a lot, that means enormous. So what are some of your advice to people who are working with analytics and trying to find a better way to pitch it?
Yeah. So at a corporate level, be aware of what the corporate drivers are. What are, look at the annual report, even for your own company. Understand how the company is measuring itself, how are employees being incented, and those are the things that you should drive perhaps the analytics at. Also understand people's personas, and so anytime that we're producing analytics for a user community, we try to understand the different personas within that user community, and how they like consuming information, what their personalities are, what's driving them professionally, and so forth, and then using that to inform how we're going to inform them.
Do you have a certain preference over the visualization that are more conducive to human cognition, like pie charts or bar charts, Spider?
Animation. I think animation is something that resonates more with people if you can show the motion of some kind of change over time. I also think that people resonate more with predictive and prescriptive kinds of analytics than just hindsight-oriented analytics. So when I see a chart going like this and then stopping at today, I'm like, well, that's great. How does that help me? So, if you can't predict what's going to happen in the future, or at least show me some scenarios of what can happen given certain kinds of conditions, then that's really just not terribly valuable to me. It's infotainment. It's not actionable.
I was just wondering, there are so many tools out there today that brings a lot of people who are in C-suite or have more of a management background come into the technical side also. More and more visualization, graphic user interfaces coming into the analysis. Neural networks, machine learning algorithms, you tools like K9, H2O, then we have PyCaret. And I was just wondering, would that actually threaten the roles of the data, the technical side of the company? You already talked about the uselessness of CIO.
Those tools are certainly going to enable the citizen data scientist, as it's called.
And Gartner actually initiated the term.
But wants to explore data and develop insights. Those kinds of tools are certainly going to help them. Also, tools that help aggregate data and integrate data, self-service data integration tools as well can enable business people. But they become dangerous. They're dangerous if they're not trained on data literacy. Then it becomes a risk for an organization to put those tools into the hands of business people that don't understand the limitations of data or the limitations of analytics. The other thing I would say is that I'm really a big fan of natural language query technologies, and I keep scratching my head wondering why they haven't become more prominent than they have. People still, for whatever reason, continue to love pointing and clicking and dragging and dropping to create analytics. I'm not sure why. Why shouldn't we be speaking to our systems the same way that we speak to, Siri or Alexa or Google Home? There have been technologies around that I worked with almost 30 years ago, a product called Intellect, which is now baked into a product from a company called Easy Ask. It's a conversational capability. You can't have a conversation with Siri or Google or Alexa right now. It's a directional kind of question and respond. But there have been technologies around for a long time that can maintain the context of the conversation in exploring data. And I have no idea why they haven't become more prominent in the industry.
I think one of the heated debates, which is quite rampant these days, is about the commercial release of the robot Sophie, which you can, by the way, have a conversation with, and a fairly decent one. Yep. Tony Robbins actually had a conversation with him, which to me sounded quite okay-ish for the beginning. And then we have Baby X, which is a baby that seems very real and is able to respond to you in very cute ways. And I was just wondering, do you see future of these technologies as well?
Yeah, I don't know much about them, but it did remind me of something I actually saw. Was it last year, where there were some top college debaters debating against a computer system, and it was a really fascinating exercise. So I'd encourage people to check that out. I was just trying to find a link on it, but I can't right now.
What was the basic premise of?
It was like, I don't know, Cambridge and Oxford or Harvard debaters debating against a computer system.
Oh, okay. I think you are old enough to have coincided with the time when IBM Watson was in first development, or actually won the quiz competition. What do you recall from this groundbreaking moment? I think you have a lot of them, from moon landing and everything.
Here's what I recall.
Okay.
I recall watching Ken Jennings' frustration in clicking in on the button. Right? He knew the answers, but he couldn't beat Watson to buzz in.
That's for sure.
I looked into that, and I learned that Watson was hardwired into the signal ready indicator. So it could respond in nanoseconds, whereas it takes a human 400 milliseconds to respond. So IBM Watson didn't win because it was smarter or knew more. It won because it could buzz in quicker, and I actually validated that with an IBM engineer who had blogged on it, and then I guess IBM took that blog down. So it's something interesting to look into. It was IBM's Watson's ability to physically interact, not cognitively interact, that won the competition.
Yeah, I think this is what actually gives computers an edge over human cognition. It talks about convolution neural networks that has become the daddy technology in Tesla, and it's finding its path and tracking. The social argument kind of resonates with me that Elon Musk makes, that it's more safe than the human driver. And I was just wondering, what's your take on that? Would you buy one?
Yes, safer than the average human driver. Yes, and probably safer than even me as a driver. The challenge is in the ethical decisions that need to be made. When there's an incident, and they tend to vary by culture. So I don't know that Tesla is ready to make decisions about whether if there's some kind of situation whether it runs over the child or whether it runs over the elderly person, right? That kind of decision differs from culture to culture. I think there was a great, I don't remember, it was MIT study, I think, a few years ago, looking into that. And so until they can not only bake the proper ethics into the system, but allow the user to tune the ethics to their own personal preferences.
What does it mean?
Then there's always going to be this debate about whether it's safer than a human.
Tell me more about it. What do you mean baking ethics? How is that possible?
If a computer-driven car has to make a decision, okay, and that decision involves running over someone versus running over somebody else, or injuring the driver, or injuring the passenger, or injuring a group of people versus an individual person, those decisions have to be made, in real time. And we as humans, don't know really how we calculate them in real time, and maybe we probably make wrong calculations all the time about that. But making that kind of ethical decision making into the system is going to become critical.
It's very funny that the only two options is to choose between who they run over instead of putting a brake to that.
Yeah.
Did you consider that there's another option called brakes?
Yeah, well, maybe there's ice, or maybe you can't brake in time, right? But yeah.
But then that would be a technical mistake that they cannot actually.
And maybe brake fast. There's a 18-wheeler semi right behind you, right? So there's all sorts of things that have to be kind of factored in.
I wish all of Elon's endeavors were that innocuous. Let's talk a little bit about the other one that he's currently testing on animals. In Sweden, they're already implanting chips in their bodies so that they can, for some reason, gain faster access. And Neuralink seems to be the extension of that. For the skeptics, it's a huge no. Even the research, they want to shut it down. For the promising ones, they're all up for that. Where do you stand on the spectrum?
I think it's inevitable that
really
humans are going to find ways to enhance ourselves. Yeah. I think at any given point in time along our journey as humans, we're going to have to put up, again, some kind of ethical, roadblocks. But I think over time, it's inevitable that we enhance and supplement our own, limited biological capabilities. Yeah.
What are the 3 facts that amazes you every single time that you listen to them, despite years of having heard them?
That I listen to whom?
3 amazing facts 3 things that amazes you that they exist or anything.
And I guess more recently, it amazes me how many people, how such a large percentage of a population can, let me be careful about this, can use obviously fake, false data in decision making.
That's one.
Not to be political or anything. So that amazes me. That they, and I guess it's human nature to gravitate toward data that aligns with your own worldview, right? But wow, that's all I got to say. And it amazes me that how many people continue to vote against their own self-interests.
Okay, only if they knew that's against their interest.
Similar, but that also amazes me. And what else amazes me? It continues to amaze me how much good there is in the world as well, and that doesn't get enough attention.
That's for true. That's actually a psychological fact. It takes 5 good experiences to forget 1 bad experience. So people are in tuned to take their negative experiences more seriously than the good ones.
Right. I've long told my wife, who's a former news producer with CNN and NBC News, and I said, listen, I would love it if they just had a news program that was just like Happy News, right? It's all good in the world, and I would watch.
It's not going to sell it.
Episode of that every day, and she says she's like, it wouldn't sell. It wouldn't sell.
That's for sure.
And I think for your reason, but I'd sure love to see somebody try.
That's a good idea. How would that actually look like?
Happy News.
Happy News.
We could all use a bit of Happy News right now.
And what would be the logo? Would it be like SpongeBob or? Okay.
It's been great being with you. I really appreciate the time.
Sure. You got to run?
Yeah, I do.
Sure. Then let's give on the final question. If you have a child of your own now, and for people around the world, what does the future hold for another 12-year-old wearing a space pajama?
I told my son, when he was younger, and I still think this is, but I said, human mortality for him and his generation and people of means will become an option.
Okay.
By the time he is in his 60s, 70s, 80s, I think there'll be a way to capture an individual's essence and perpetuate it.
What better message to end on, if not that? Thank you so much for being with us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. So I told my son to say hello to my great grandchildren. So
that would be great. For everyone else, thank you so much for tuning in. You can have the conversations on Slack, and check out the podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify. See you next week with another guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Real pleasure.